At 72, I believed the hardest chapter of my life had already passed. My husband, Richard, had been gone for nearly 5 years, and the quiet that followed his death had settled into every corner of my days. Some mornings I still reached across the bed expecting to find him there. Other times I would hear a floorboard creak in the hallway and think for a split second that he was coming home from the hardware store like he always had. Grief changes over time, but it never truly leaves. It simply learns how to sit beside you without speaking. Richard and I had spent 43 years building a life together. We weren't wealthy people, but we worked hard for everything we had. The house we lived in wasn't just a building. It was the place where we raised our son, Daniel. It was where birthday candles were blown out, Christmas trees were decorated, and family dinners stretched late into the evening. Every room held a memory. Every wall carried a story. After Richard passed away, I learned how to manage on my own. It wasn't easy, but I was stronger than most people realized. I handled the bills, maintained the property, and kept myself busy with gardening and volunteering at the local library. I missed my husband every day, but I was determined not to spend the rest of my life feeling sorry for myself. Around that time, Daniel's life began falling apart. He lost his job unexpectedly when the company he worked for downsized. His wife, Melissa, was pregnant with their second child, and the stress was showing on both of them. Their savings were disappearing faster than they expected, and they were struggling to keep up with their mortgage payments. Every time Daniel called me, I could hear the worry in his voice. One evening he came over alone. I remember exactly where we sat. He was at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He looked exhausted. "I don't know what we're going to do, Mom," he admitted quietly. No mother wants to hear those words from her child. Without hesitation, I told him they could move in with me temporarily. The house was large enough. There were empty bedrooms. More importantly, family helps family. At least that's what I had always believed. At first, the arrangement seemed perfect. Melissa was grateful. The children filled the house with energy. Again, their laughter echoed through rooms that had felt empty for years. Family dinners returned. Holiday gatherings felt alive once more. For a while, I convinced myself that Richard would have loved seeing the house full again. But as months turned into years, things began changing in ways that were so subtle I barely noticed them. Daniel and Melissa slowly took over the routines of the household. They rearranged furniture. They painted rooms. They made decisions without asking me first. None of it seemed important enough to argue about. I told myself they were simply making the place comfortable for their children to give them more space. I moved into the guest cottage behind the main house. It was a small but comfortable place that Richard had built years earlier as a workshop. Before converting it into a living area, everyone praised my decision. "You're so generous. You're such a wonderful mother. Most people wouldn't do what you're doing." I smiled and accepted the compliments. What nobody saw was how gradually I disappeared from my own life. Family dinners happened without anyone checking whether I wanted to attend. Decisions about the property were made before I heard about them. Friends who visited often assumed Daniel and Melissa owned the house because they were the ones answering the door. I never corrected anyone. Part of me didn't want to create tension. Another part feared sounding possessive or selfish. I had spent my entire life putting other people first. Speaking up felt uncomfortable, so I stayed quiet. Every year I continued paying the property taxes. Every repair bill came to me. When the roof needed maintenance, I paid for it. When the water heater failed, I replaced it. When insurance premiums increased, the payments still came from my account. Nobody asked how much those expenses cost. Nobody offered to share them. I told myself it didn't matter, because they were family. Looking back now, I realized something important. People rarely notice the sacrifices that become routine. The first favor receives gratitude. The 100th favor becomes an expectation. And expectations have a dangerous habit of turning generosity into entitlement. The children grew older. Daniel eventually found steady work again. Melissa started a successful online business. Their financial situation improved year after year. Yet nothing changed. They remained in the main house. I remained in the cottage. The arrangement that had started as temporary slowly became permanent in everyone's mind except mine. Sometimes I would walk through the garden at sunset and look toward the house Richard and I had built together. Lights glowed in the windows. The sounds of family drifted through the air. From a distance, it looked warm and welcoming. Yet there were moments when I felt less like the owner of that home and more like a guest who happened to live on the property. The text arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the kind of afternoon that usually passed without much notice. I was sitting on the small porch of the guest cottage with a cup of tea cooling beside me and a gardening magazine open on my lap. The sky was clear, the breeze was gentle, and for the first time in weeks, I felt completely at peace. Then my phone buzzed. I glanced down expecting a message from a friend or perhaps one of the grandchildren. Instead, I saw Melissa's name. My daughter-in-law rarely texted me directly. Most communication came through Daniel. If Melissa reached out herself, it was usually for something specific. I opened the message. "You're moving out. We need the room." That was it. No greeting, no explanation, no question mark, no request. Just a statement. For several seconds, I simply stared at the screen. I read the words once, then twice, then a third time. My first thought wasn't anger. It was confusion. I honestly wondered whether she had sent the message to the wrong person. I typed a response. "What do you mean?" Several minutes passed before her reply arrived. "We've been discussing it for a while. The kids need more space, and honestly, it makes sense for you now." I felt something tighten in my chest. Makes sense. Those two words bothered me more than the original text. Who had decided it made sense? When had this discussion happened? Why was I only hearing about it after the decision had apparently already been made? I called Daniel immediately. The call went to voicemail. I waited 10 minutes and tried again. This time he answered. His voice sounded nervous before I even spoke. "Mom." I hated the way he said it. There was guilt in that single word. I got straight to the point. "Did you know about Melissa's message?" A long silence followed. Then he sighed. "Mom, don't get upset." That sentence alone told me everything. People only say don't get upset when they know exactly how upsetting something is. "Daniel," I said carefully, "did you know?" "Yes." The answer landed harder than I expected. Not because I disagreed with them, not because I felt entitled to anything, but because my own son had apparently been discussing my future without ever speaking to me about it. For a moment, I couldn't find words. I looked out across the yard toward the house Richard and I had spent decades paying for. The house where Daniel had grown up, the house where I had welcomed them when they needed help. The house whose taxes still came out of my bank account every year. And somehow, decisions about my life were being made inside it without me. Daniel continued talking. "We've been thinking about what's best." "Best for who?" I asked quietly. Another silence. Then he began explaining how the children needed additional bedrooms, how the property layout could be improved, how the guest cottage wasn't ideal for someone my age, how there were other options available. Every sentence made me feel smaller, not because of what he was saying, because of what he wasn't saying. There wasn't a single acknowledgement that I might have an opinion, not one question about what I wanted, not one pause to ask whether I was happy where I was. The decision had already been made. They were simply informing me that after we ended the call, I sat alone for nearly an hour. I kept replaying the conversation. At first I tried to give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they were worried about me. Maybe they genuinely believed they were helping. Maybe I was overreacting. But then strange memories started resurfacing. Little comments, small conversations, things I had dismissed at the time. Melissa mentioning retirement communities. Daniel asking whether I had updated my will. Questions about estate planning that had seemed harmless months earlier. Suddenly those moments felt different. That evening, my phone buzzed repeatedly. Not from Daniel, not from Melissa, from relatives. A cousin asked whether I was excited about the move, and aunt said she heard I was finally downsizing. A family friend congratulated me on making such a practical decision. I stared at each message in disbelief. Nobody was asking if the rumors were true. They already believed them, because someone had been telling the story for weeks, maybe months. And that someone wasn't me. The realization hit like a punch. While I was living quietly in the cottage, believing everything was fine, a completely different version of events had been spreading through the family. A version where moving was my idea. A version where I was preparing for the next stage of life. A version where Daniel and Melissa would naturally take over the property. I felt embarrassed, not because I had done anything wrong, because I suddenly understood how many conversations had happened without me, how many assumptions had formed, how many plans had been made behind closed doors. The next morning, things became even worse. My sister called. She sounded unusually cheerful. "Have you found a place yet?" she asked. "A place for what?" "For after you move." The words nearly stopped my heart. I asked who told her I was moving. She laughed lightly. "Everybody knows, dear. Everybody knows." Those two words echoed in my head long after the call ended. Everybody knew except me. That afternoon I drove into town to clear my head. I sat in a small coffee shop and watched people pass by the windows. For the first time since Richard died, I felt truly alone. Not because I lacked family, because I no longer understood my place within it. Somewhere along the way, I had gone from being the owner of my life to being the subject of other people's plans. And the most painful part wasn't the property. It wasn't the cottage. It wasn't even the possibility of moving. The most painful part was realizing that the people I loved most had already decided what would happen next, and never once thought I deserved a seat at the conversation. The morning after those conversations, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the text message anymore. It wasn't even the rumors spreading through the family. It was the certainty behind them. Daniel and Melissa weren't acting like people making a suggestion. They were acting like people carrying out a plan that had already been approved. That difference stayed with me. For the first time in years, I began paying attention to details I normally ignored. I started with something simple: paperwork. Over the decades, Richard had always been the organized one. He kept documents neatly stored in a fireproof cabinet in the main house. After he died, I moved most of those records into the guest cottage, but I hadn't looked through them in years. There had never been a reason to. Now there was. That afternoon, I unlocked an old cedar chest that sat at the foot of my bed. Inside were folders, insurance records, tax statements, bank documents, and dozens of papers dating back 30 years. At first, I wasn't searching for anything specific. I simply wanted reassurance. I wanted proof that I wasn't imagining things. Hours passed as I sorted through old files. The deeper I looked, the more memories surfaced. Richard's handwriting appeared on envelopes, receipts from family vacations, mortgage statements from decades ago, photographs tucked between folders. For a while, I forgot why I had started. Then I found a sealed envelope. My name was written on the front in Richard's unmistakable handwriting. It wasn't hidden exactly, but it wasn't something I had ever opened either. The envelope looked old, very old. Carefully, I slid a finger beneath the seal. Inside was a letter. The date at the top caught my attention immediately. Richard had written it nearly 12 years earlier, long before his illness. Long before anyone imagined the family conflicts that would eventually emerge. I sat down and began reading. The first page was personal. He talked about our marriage, about how grateful he was for the life we had built together, about how much he trusted me. By the second page, the tone changed. Richard began discussing the property, specifically ownership. My pulse quickened. According to the letter, years earlier he had quietly restructured several legal documents after watching a painful inheritance dispute tear apart one of his own relatives' families. The experience had frightened him. He worried about what might happen after we were gone. More importantly, he worried about what might happen if one of us was left alone. His solution had been simple. Everything had been placed entirely under my control. Not Daniel's. Not anyone else. Single quotes S. Mine. I kept reading. Tucked behind the letter was another folder. Inside were legal documents I barely remembered signing. Property records. Trust paperwork. Ownership transfers. Every page confirmed the same thing. The entire property remained solely in my name. The main house, the guest cottage, the surrounding land, all of it. There were no co-owners, no hidden agreements, no automatic transfers, no rights granted to anyone else. Legally speaking, nothing had changed. Yet that wasn't the real surprise. The real surprise came several pages later. Richard had included instructions, detailed instructions. He explained exactly why he had structured everything this way. He wrote that generosity and ownership were not the same thing. Allowing someone to live in your home did not mean surrendering it. Helping family did not require giving away your future. And most importantly, kindness should never be mistaken for permission. I must have read those pages 5 times. Each reading revealed something new. For years I had worried that speaking up would make me selfish. Richard clearly disagreed. In his eyes, protecting what we built wasn't selfish at all. It was responsible. As the afternoon faded into evening, another realization slowly emerged. Daniel didn't know any of this. Neither did Melissa. In fact, I wasn't sure anyone besides Richard's attorney and me knew. The rumors spreading through the family suddenly made more sense. They were operating on assumptions, dangerous assumptions. They assumed the property would eventually become theirs. They assumed enough time had passed. They assumed that because they occupied the house, they somehow controlled it. Most importantly, they assumed I no longer understood my own affairs. For the first time since Melissa's text arrived, I felt something other than hurt, clarity. The situation hadn't changed. The truth had simply become visible. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't confused. I wasn't dependent on anyone's permission. The evidence sat directly in front of me. Signed, stamped, recorded, and protected. As evening settled outside the cottage windows, I continued reviewing the documents. Near the bottom of the folder, I found one final page attached to Richard's letter. Just a few paragraphs. Nothing dramatic. No legal language, no instructions. Simply a message written for me. He said that one day there might come a moment when someone questioned my judgment, my strength, or my right to make decisions for myself. If that day ever arrived, he wanted me to remember something. The house wasn't the important thing. The important thing was refusing to let other people decide who I was. I sat quietly for a long time after reading those words. The room felt different somehow. Larger, calmer. Whatever they planned, it was happening soon. An hour later, everyone gathered around the dining table. Nearly 30 people filled the room. Family members, close friends, neighbors, people who had known me for decades. The atmosphere was cheerful, at least on the surface. Then Daniel stood up. The room gradually became quiet. He raised his glass and thanked everyone for coming. At first his speech sounded ordinary. He talked about family, about gratitude, about new beginnings. Then he shifted directions. I watched several people exchange knowing looks. Melissa reached for his hand. The performance was beginning. Daniel spoke about change, about getting older, about making difficult decisions for the future. Then he looked directly at me. Mom has always put family first, he said. Several people nodded. She's spent her whole life taking care of everyone else. More nods. I remained silent. He continued. And sometimes the best way we can honor someone is by helping them take the next step in life. The room grew noticeably quieter. Nobody touched their food. Nobody spoke. Everyone was waiting. Melissa stood and placed a colorful brochure on the table. The cover showed smiling seniors sitting in a sunny courtyard, an assisted living community. I heard several people murmur softly. Then Melissa spoke. We've been discussing options that would make life easier for Mom. The words were carefully chosen, designed to sound loving, supportive, reasonable. For a moment, I simply looked around the room. Face after face stared back at me. Some appeared concerned. Some appeared uncomfortable. A few seemed genuinely convinced they were witnessing an act of kindness. That was the saddest part. Many of them honestly believed they were helping, because they had only heard one version of the story. Daniel slid a document across the table. Mom, he said gently, we've taken care of everything. The paper stopped directly in front of me. I didn't touch it. I already knew what it was. Property transfer paperwork, prepared in advance, waiting for my signature, waiting for me to play the role they had assigned. A long silence followed. Everyone watched, expecting hesitation, expecting emotion, expecting resistance. Instead, I smiled. The reaction confused them immediately. Daniel frowned. Melissa blinked. Several relatives shifted uncomfortably. Then I opened my purse, slowly and calmly. I removed a folder and placed it on the table. No dramatic gestures, no raised voice, no anger, just facts. I opened the folder and removed the first document, the original property deed. I placed it beside their paperwork. Then I removed the trust documents, then Richard's letter. The room became silent, completely silent. I looked at Daniel. First, then Melissa, then everyone else. I think there's been a misunderstanding, I said. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The property was never transferred. Daniel's expression changed instantly, confusion, then disbelief, then panic. I continued. The house remains entirely in my name. Several relatives leaned forward. Others exchanged shocked glances. One aunt actually removed her glasses and reread the deed herself. I let them, facts speak for themselves. Daniel tried to interrupt. There must be. There isn't. My voice remained calm, steady, controlled. Double quotes, the documents are valid. The records are current. Everything has been reviewed. Melissa's face lost color. For the first time all afternoon, she looked genuinely afraid. Not because she hated me, because she suddenly realized the foundation of their entire plan didn't exist. I turned to the final document, Richard's letter. The room listened as I read several passages aloud. His words filled the silence. Words about family, responsibility, respect. Words about generosity never requiring surrender. Words about protecting what you build. By the time I finished reading, nobody was looking at me the way they had an hour earlier. The assumptions were gone. The story had changed, and the truth was sitting directly in front of them. Then came the moment nobody expected, including me. Melissa began crying, not the carefully controlled tears from earlier, real tears. The kind that arrive when fear finally collapses. She admitted how terrified she had been of losing stability for her children. How years of financial struggle had convinced her that security could disappear. Overnight, for the first time, I saw the fear underneath all the manipulation. It didn't excuse what she had done, but it explained it. And understanding matters, even when forgiveness takes longer. I closed the folder. The room remained quiet. Nobody applauded. Nobody argued. There was no dramatic victory, just truth, clear and unavoidable. Before leaving, I shared one final decision. The property had already been placed into a trust, not for me, not for Daniel, not for Melissa. For the grandchildren, their future would be protected. The house would remain in the family, but no one would ever be able to pressure, manipulate, or claim ownership of it again. For a moment, nobody knew what to say. Then my granddaughter quietly walked across the room and wrapped her arms around me. And somehow, in that single moment, the entire afternoon stopped being about property, documents, or ownership. It became about something much simpler. The difference between control and love. The difference between entitlement and gratitude. The difference between deciding someone else's future and respecting their right to choose it for themselves.